Imagine that hidden within every cell of your body lies an ancient secret, a story of death, desperation, and struggle that nearly brought humanity to its end. Though we are unaware of it, our very DNA bears the mark of a terrifying event, a catastrophe so devastating that it forever altered the fate of our species. What science has just uncovered is chilling. Thousands of years ago, the known world turned into a nightmare. This wasn't merely a war between rival tribes or an isolated territorial dispute. It was a conflict of unimaginable proportions, a silent battle that left an indelible scar in the DNA of every human alive today. A period of extreme violence reduced our population drastically, impacting every growing civilization and putting the survival of humanity at risk. But the most unsettling part? This event, which nearly drove us to extinction, was never recorded on ancient clay tablets or chronicled by lost civilizations. No ruins, no fossilized weapons hold its memory. Instead, its only evidence is embedded in the genetic code within us all. Like a hidden message in our biology, the information stored in our genes reveals an unprecedented population collapse. A team of scientists has identified a terrifying phenomenon known as a genetic bottleneck, an event in which the human population suffered a dramatic decline, pushing our species to the brink of oblivion. By analyzing the DNA of modern populations, scientists have managed to reconstruct part of this dark chapter in our history. And what they discovered challenges everything we thought we knew. This collapse wasn't caused by a natural catastrophe like a volcanic eruption or extreme climate change, nor was it the result of a devastating pandemic. The evidence points to something far more sinister and disturbing. Thousands of years ago, during what we now call the late Neolithic, an era of massive violence reshaped human history. This was not a single conflict, but a series of brutal clashes that spread across the inhabited world. Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and other regions experienced a wave of violence that wiped out entire populations. It was a silent, merciless war, one without organized armies or advanced weaponry, yet its impact was devastating. Throughout history, humanity has known war, but never before had there been an annihilation of such magnitude and scale. What makes this event even more unsettling is that its traces are not found in fossils or traditional archaeological records. They are hidden within our own DNA. Every human alive today is a descendant of those who managed to survive this slaughter. But how and why did something like this happen? Some theories suggest that rising tensions among expanding human groups may have triggered an unprecedented spiral of violence. As communities grew and competed for resources, conflicts intensified until they reached a point of no return. What may have started as disputes over fertile land and water sources could have escalated into a brutal war for survival, one where only the strongest endured. But there is something even more disturbing about this discovery: the genetic impact it left on our species. This period not only drastically reduced our population, but also shaped the genetics of modern humans. Some traits we consider fundamental to our species may have emerged as a result of this intense evolutionary pressure. What does this dark chapter of our history mean for humanity today? Could this pattern repeat itself in the future? And most terrifying of all, what does it reveal about our true nature? Are you enjoying what you're watching? If so, consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me keep creating content like this for you. It costs you nothing, and it motivates me a lot to keep making more videos. So if you want to support the channel, go ahead and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss anything. The answers may be more unsettling than we ever imagined. The most unsettling aspect of this genetic collapse is that it did not affect men and women equally. The bottleneck was only detected in the diversity of the Y chromosome, which is exclusive to men and passed from father to son. However, when researchers analyzed mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited solely through the maternal line, they found no similar decline in female genetic diversity. This means that something happened, something that wiped out an enormous number of men while largely sparing women. But what could have caused such a staggering disparity? Researchers arrived at an alarming conclusion. An unprecedented level of violence could be the answer. If the cause had been a volcanic eruption, an extreme climate event, or another natural catastrophe, we would expect to see a decrease in genetic diversity in both men and women, not just in males. But that wasn't the case, and saying that the male population simply declined would be an understatement. The more accurate term is annihilated. Estimates suggest that this event was so brutal and unforgiving that by the time it was over, the effective male population in Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East had been reduced by up to 95%. Put simply, for every 20 men, only one survived. To put this into perspective, this means that women may have outnumbered men by a staggering ratio of 17 to 1. No recorded conflict in history comes close to this level of male mortality in percentage terms. Not even World War I or World War II caused such a catastrophic reduction in the male population. To replicate an event of this magnitude today, we would have to imagine a war in which 3.9 billion men perished, leaving only 200 million survivors worldwide. If such a terrifying event truly occurred, one would expect to find archaeological evidence, skeletons, weapons, remnants of battlefields, and in fact, the proof is everywhere. In Europe alone, more than 250 late Neolithic archaeological sites have been identified with clear evidence of violent deaths. And that's just one part of the world. Human remains from this era are notoriously brutal, showing a significantly higher number of injuries and signs of violence compared to both earlier and later periods. A study of over 2,300 skeletons from early farming societies revealed that more than 10% of men and women bore weapon-inflicted wounds, likely the result of raids, resource-driven attacks, and conflicts over land and livestock. Another study in Spain, which analyzed the remains of 1,138 individuals, found that 23% showed signs of violent trauma, with adult men and teenage boys being the primary victims. In fact, a staggering 97% of bodies with unhealed wounds were male, suggesting they died in combat at overwhelming rates. Even those who survived didn't last long. 81% of individuals with healed wounds had suffered multiple episodes of violence throughout their lives. However, despite these high numbers, they still don't account for the 95% male disappearance suggested by the genetic study. But this is where a crucial factor comes into play. Not all violent deaths leave marks on bones. Forensic analyses have shown that only 15% of fatal sharp weapon attacks leave skeletal injuries. If someone dies from hemorrhaging, internal trauma, or soft tissue wounds, no trace remains in their bones. Moreover, war doesn't just kill in battle. Disease, infections, and famine triggered by conflict could have played a key role in the mass disappearance of men. The evidence is there. The Neolithic world was far more brutal than we ever imagined. But this is only the beginning. What could have caused such a devastating war? Throughout history, humanity has witnessed brutal conflicts. However, what happened in the late Neolithic was not just another war. It was a period of extreme systematic violence where massacres were so frequent that they left an indelible mark on our DNA. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous sites of extermination, places where entire populations were mercilessly wiped out. And among them, some stand out for their sheer brutality. One of the most terrifying discoveries is the so-called death pit of Talheim, located in Germany and dated to 7,000 years ago. Here, scientists unearthed the remains of at least 34 individuals who were slaughtered with extreme violence. The most chilling aspect? None of the skeletons had defensive wounds, indicating that these people were not fighting back but desperately fleeing when they were attacked. There was no battle, only an indiscriminate massacre. Researchers identified 3 types of lethal injuries among the victims: deaths caused by sharp-edged blows from a stone axe, deaths from blunt force trauma inflicted by the same weapon, deaths by arrows, though only 3 of the 34 bodies bore such wounds. The blows were precise and fatal, almost always targeting the head. In fact, 30 out of the 34 skeletons had lethal skull fractures, and in some cases, victims suffered multiple fatal strikes, suggesting the attackers ensured that no one was left alive. The group of victims included 16 children, 9 adult men, and 7 older women. But there was something strange. Young women were missing. This pattern is repeated across many Neolithic massacres and suggests something deeply unsettling. Women of reproductive age were not killed, but captured as war spoils. To the attackers, these women were trophies of conquest, likely forced to integrate into their communities. The attack took place in a settlement that had been fortified with wooden palisades, a sign that even back then, protecting oneself from other humans was essential. But not even walls were enough to stop the slaughter. If the massacre at Talheim was brutal, the one at Schlitz, Austria, was even worse. It also took place around 7,000 years ago, but this time, the number of victims rose to 200 people. The bodies were carelessly dumped into a mass grave, a clear sign that the city had been attacked and plundered. And just like in Talheim, young women were missing from the dead, reinforcing the theory of mass abductions as part of warfare. However, there were terrifying differences in this massacre. Here, the attackers didn't just kill their victims, they dismembered many of them. Among the remains, archaeologists found skeletons without arms or legs, and some skulls were discovered separated from their bodies. This suggests that the attackers may have practiced ritual dismemberment, whether as a cultural tradition or as a way to terrorize their enemies. And this wasn't just happening in Europe. In Asia, headhunting was a common practice, suggesting that different Neolithic cultures had their own ways of punishing and humiliating the defeated. The violence of the late Neolithic was not an isolated phenomenon. These massacre sites are just a few of the hundreds that have been discovered, all pointing to the same conclusions: brutal tribal wars, mass exterminations of men, kidnapping of women and children, ritual mutilation, and torture. But why did all of this happen? What drove humanity to such an extreme level of violence? The answers may be hidden in our DNA. When we think of prehistory, we imagine a world of nomadic tribes, hunters and gatherers, agricultural villages. But what happened in Herxheim, Germany between 7,300 and 7,000 years ago shatters any romanticized image of the past. This was not just a war nor a simple massacre, it was a systematic bloodbath on a scale never seen before in prehistory. Unlike other sites where villages were attacked and massacred, archaeologists believe that Herxheim was not the victim, but the executioner. Here, at least 80 pits have been discovered filled with human remains. The estimated death toll ranges between 1,000 and 1,500 people, from newborns to the elderly. If we adjust this number to the population density of that time, it would be the modern equivalent of finding 800,000 corpses piled up just outside a city's walls. But the most horrifying part isn't the sheer number of dead, it's how the bodies were treated. The remains found at Herxheim have baffled archaeologists for years. Fragmented bones, carefully manipulated skulls, and signs that the bodies were treated with great precision suggest that this community had very particular rituals. It is believed that skulls played a special role in their ceremonies. Some remains show evidence of being meticulously processed, indicating a deep understanding of the human body. Tools and ornaments made from bones have also been discovered, suggesting that every part of the body had a purpose in their culture. Even near the entrance of the settlement, spears have been found, possibly carrying symbolic significance. Herxheim remains a mystery, a place where the rituals and beliefs of an ancient society left behind traces that still challenge us to understand their true meaning. But the most unsettling question is, who were these victims? Isotope analysis of the bones reveals that they were not just local villagers. Some of the dead were farmers, others hunter-gatherers, and some even came from distant mountains and plains. In other words, the inhabitants of Herxheim were not just attacking their neighbors, they were carrying out large-scale raids, capturing people from different cultures as far as 500 kilometers away. This suggests something incredibly disturbing, a level of planning, logistics, and military strategy that challenges our understanding of Neolithic societies. Despite their brutal dominance, the final fate of Herxheim remains unknown. Archaeologists have discovered that shortly after the massacres, the village was completely abandoned. No trace of battle, no sign of internal conflict. They simply vanished. Did the prisoners rebel and exterminate their captors? Did a rival group avenge their dead and destroy the settlement? Or did this community practice a ritual that ultimately led to their own destruction? The only certainty is that Herxheim is the largest prehistoric massacre site ever discovered. And the most unsettling fact is that it was not an isolated case. Far from being an era of peace, the Neolithic was a time of constant struggles. Communities fought for survival in a world where conflicts were frequent and security was never guaranteed. Archaeological findings suggest that some cultures had a profound reverence for skulls, while others performed complex rituals with the remains of their dead. In certain regions, clashes with outsiders were common, and unusual burials have led to many interpretations of the beliefs of that time. Weapons varied from axes and spears to everyday tools that could be used in combat. However, protective gear was limited, and clothing consisted of animal skins, rudimentary fabrics, or hardened leather. In this harsh environment, life was short and challenging, especially for those caught in violent confrontations. The Neolithic was a time of profound change, where survival depended on adaptation in a world that was constantly shifting. Why did such extreme violence exist? Perhaps it was a way to assert power, mark territory, or simply a response to uncertain times. Why would an entire society engage in such radical practices? Maybe they were part of elaborate rituals that we are only beginning to understand, or perhaps they were driven by deeply ingrained beliefs. Why was the Neolithic marked by constant conflict? It could be that resource competition, fear of the unknown, or the relentless struggle for survival played a key role. Maybe the answer lies within our own nature. Maybe we have always been this way. And the most unsettling thought is that if there were no rules for war back then, if there's one thing that becomes clear when looking at the Neolithic, it's that humanity seemed to be trapped in an endless war. Village against village, tribe against tribe, each group seeing the other as an enemy. But why? What drove our ancestors into such a spiral of extreme violence? There isn't a single clear answer, but several hypotheses exist. And the most ironic part? One of the most widely accepted theories suggests that humanity's own success is what condemned us to war. It all started with the Neolithic Revolution, also known as the First Agricultural Revolution. This was the moment when many human cultures abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and began settling in permanent communities. Hunting and gathering gave way to farming and animal domestication. This led to unprecedented population growth and the creation of the first villages and cities. In theory, this was a positive advancement, but in practice, it introduced new reasons for violence. Villages could no longer simply move if food became scarce. Surplus food attracted invaders and thieves. Defined territories emerged, leading to land disputes. The existence of permanent settlements allowed for the organization of armies. New agricultural tools could also be used as weapons. In short, civilization gave rise to organized warfare. Settlements were no longer just homes, but strategic targets filled with food, tools, and women, making them irresistible to aggressive groups. Moreover, merely seeing a settlement might have been interpreted as an existential threat. In a world where resources were still limited, the idea of sharing with outsiders wasn't a viable option. And so, the logic of kill before you are killed was born. Curiously, when geneticists analyzed the DNA of modern populations, they discovered an intriguing phenomenon. At some point during the Neolithic, the diversity of the Y chromosome plummeted drastically. This means that, for reasons still debated, the number of men who passed on their lineage became incredibly low. One of the most fascinating explanations is that, with the rise of agriculture and the formation of patriarchal clans, societies reorganized in a way that severely restricted male mobility. Men could only reproduce within their own clans. Outsiders were not welcome and were often executed. Women, on the other hand, had greater freedom of movement between clans. As a result, only a few male lineages survived, leading to a genetic bottleneck in the Y chromosome. Some communities thrived and expanded, while others simply vanished over time. This suggests that not all of the genetic decline was due to warfare and massacres. More subtle processes, such as natural selection and shifts in social structures, also played a role in shaping genetic diversity. Another theory proposes that the decline of the Y chromosome wasn't solely due to war, but also to a peaceful process called lineal fission. Essentially, family clans would constantly split into smaller groups. Since these new clans were made up of closely related men, their Y chromosomes were more vulnerable to disappearing over time due to natural disasters, disease, or simply a lack of reproductive success. This phenomenon, combined with violence, may have drastically reduced male genetic diversity during the Neolithic. In fact, some geneticists believe that both explanations are correct, that a combination of war, environmental factors, and social changes played a role in what could be described as a near-apocalyptic event for male genetics. The most incredible part of all this is that the traces of this genetic collapse can still be seen today. Some populations still haven't regained the same level of genetic diversity they had before the Neolithic. If violence and societal changes during the Neolithic hadn't drastically reduced the male population, our world could be genetically very different today. But if there's one thing we can take away from all of this, it's that, although the Neolithic was an era of extreme brutality, at least today, we don't go around killing anyone who crosses our path. Most of the time. Then again, if we look at recent history, maybe we haven't changed as much as we'd like to think. Actually, we didn't change, at least not in an absolute sense. If we talk in pure numbers, more people have died in wars throughout history than during the Neolithic, but the key difference is that our population has grown much faster than we've been able to destroy ourselves. This means that, in relative terms, violence has decreased. The real transformation came with the development of more complex societies, where trade, diplomacy, and political structures began to replace constant warfare as tools for survival. But if we analyze history, we realize that this decline in violence is actually a very recent phenomenon. Over the last 6 centuries, wars didn't disappear, but their frequency and lethality have followed interesting patterns. In fact, though it may be hard to believe with everything happening in the world today, we are actually living in one of the most peaceful eras in human history. And this is reflected in our life expectancy, which is now 3 times longer than that of Neolithic humans. Obviously, we don't live in a utopia. Wars, conflicts, and violence still exist, but at least it's no longer the norm to live in constant fear that a neighboring tribe will massacre our entire village for resources. Personally, I'm glad I don't have to worry about macabre cults collecting skulls or warriors hunting for human trophies in battle. Well, for the most part.